My name is Danny Fenton and I'm an aeromodeller and an engineer. Join me on a fascinating journey where I show you some of the techniques used in scale aeromodelling. The fairing is nicely trimmed and has been fitted down onto the fuselage, and I've held it, well, I didn't have to hold it down, but I just held it in place while I ran thin CA right along the edges, and I didn't need to hold anything down because it all fits really well. So a little spritz of CA activator just to get it to set, and it's all on, and it's actually made the fin even more solid than it was, so it's doing its job. I've drilled small holes all the way along the top of the fin there. I'm just going to put a drop of glue in there, thin CA. Actually I can see it's wicked in underneath, which is exactly what I was going to do with this little piece of piano wire. That's wicked in really nicely. I can see it moving along the joint. So I've got a good section there, and it's still, you can see it actually still weeping along, or the capillary action is getting it to move along, so that's working really well. I'm just going to give it a little press, see if that, no, I think it's probably more or less dry now, but that there will give me enough grip on the top. I don't think it needed it, but just in case. And those small holes will easily be filled with some filler. So that's the fairing part fitted. If I move the fuselage along a little bit, you should be able to see what's going on at the back here. So what we're doing here is I glued the rear fairing to the tailplane on both sides, and then I used a razor saw and cut through two sections so that when the tailplane was slid backwards, it comes off with it, and when it goes forwards, it lines up. Now I don't want this joint to be perfect, so we'll probably build up the forward bit with a bit of filler or something, just to raise it up a little bit, because I don't want the two panels to be in alignment, because on the full size they're not, and this one in fact tucks underneath that one. So what I may do is extend this one a little bit further forward and sand the underside of that one a little bit, so that this just appears to go underneath that forward one. And that's the trick we're going to use. Now around this area, which is going to be quite difficult to sort, I'm going to build up this section here with filler, and all of this is going to be filler, and it's going to go all the way around, and I'll use the microlight filler mixed with epoxy to produce a really light fairing compound. But this section of the tailplane that comes off, I'll pull it and you'll see, there we go, this section I'll probably coat with some tape or something to stop the filler that I'm using around here sticking to it. Now you can see where the panel line should be, but I can't do that because of the shape of the tailplane. It's not the right shape. So that's the actual size I should make it, but that's the size that the joint is going to, that's the size of the joint. So I think what I'll do is I'll come out a little bit, and I'll come out a little bit on this one as well. So I'll sort of be sitting halfway between what I've got and what I wanted. And I think that'll be enough of an optical illusion that everything is more or less right. But the film on top of this will just mean that when I pull it apart, it should separate, I hope, and make a really nice hidden seam along there for when the tailplane comes off. And then I can sculpt all of this filler into a nice fairing that actually comes right out on the tailplane. So could be quite interesting. Let me just find the photo. So I'm sure you can see there, move it up a bit, I'm sure you can see there the fairing that I'm talking about, and it tucks underneath the larger one. Moving on to the fairings that go around the leading edge of the tailplane and merge into the fuselage. What I've done is I've trapped some lithoplate under the fairing and against the bit of the fuselage that stays put, and it overlaps the tailplane that comes off. And there's a thin strip, and it's glued with thick CA, and you just literally put a blob of it on, and then you use some activator to just set it so that it doesn't soak in or anything, it just sits on the surface. And you're using it a bit like you would a tack weld. And I've just tacked litho plate flush against the tailplane. And then there's another strip that you can't actually see, but it's quite narrow, and it wraps around the leading edge and goes underneath and does the same thing against the fuselage on the underside. And I have pulled the tailplane off, and it does come off cleanly, so it hasn't stuck to the tailplane. So all of this glue is actually just on the surface and holding the inner edge and the inner edge of all the litho to the fuselage, which it can bond to, not bonding to the tailplane. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix up some, what the Americans would call Bondo, or we call it P38 body filler, and it's a polyester based poly filler, and I'm going to use a little bit to build up this area here, and I'll go right underneath, so I'll probably have to roll the fuselage onto its side to do the underside. And all I want to do is just get a good lump of filler on there, all the way around there, not going near the tailplane, although I have put some tape on just in case so that it doesn't stick. And then we'll file and sand all that up to shape. In fact, we'll probably carve it while it's gone to the jelly state, and then we'll sand it later. All right, so let's mix some filler. Right, here's the filler, all nicely mixed. I'm just going to clag some on and see how we go. Right, I'm going to have to flip the fuselage. We're probably going to have to add another layer on top of this. I'll have to see. Right, I'm going to leave that alone now. Because the more I touch it and the more I move it, the worse it's getting. So, and as you can see, it's already gone spongy. So we'll give it another 2 or 3 minutes and we should be able to carve that. And we'll just take the worst of the ridges out. Then another minute. You can see now it's turned to rubber. So we'll just take the lumps out with it like that. Not that there are very many. With it in this state, it's just like cutting cheese. Starting to get much harder now, it's more like hard cheese. Right, that'll do for now, and the rest will take off once we pull the tailplane off, and then we can see what we're doing. It's been another couple of minutes, and it's still, well, it's actually getting quite brittle now, which is good. So I'm going to take the tailplane off before it goes any further. It should come off. There we go. And there you can see the ridge that we have. And the litho plate is held in place by the filler. And that was why I wanted to wait for it to just harden up a bit more. So we'll let that harden up a bit more than that. Give it another 5 minutes or so. And then we'll go in there with some sanding files, permagrip needle files, that sort of stuff. And see if we can get that to look kind of like a fairing. think you can see how useful these permagrip tools are in all the different shapes. Even the shapes you don't think you'll use are very useful. And there we have a radius on that edge, which is looking good. Right, so that's as good as we're going to get on that side. What I'm really frightened of is bending the litho plate. If I just catch it with the tool, then it will be a bit damaged. I don't want that. What might actually help is if I put the tailplane back in, it might actually support this unsupported section. Let's put the tailplane back on. Yeah, that gives us a lot more freedom to move the file around a little bit more. Right, so you get the general idea of what we've been trying to achieve there. And the tailplane still comes off, but that tab there is incredibly delicate. The one at the bottom's not quite so bad, but it's still a sharp edge that very easily could get damaged. That one is the worry though. I think I may need to make something that sort of protects that area there, because if it's travelling in the van or going to an event abroad and it's in a crate or anything, this is as exposed as the rear end will be. So that point there is vulnerable. There we go, that'll do for now. We've still got to build up a panel line that goes around there from that line there, so we need to put some tape on this side of the line, right down there and round that curve there, and then we'll build up the edge with filler and then sand it away and take the tape away, and that'll leave us a panel line. But I'll show you all that later. Just got to do the same on the other side now. Okay, so you've seen how I've done this fairing. However, I'm not happy with that. Because if you look at this picture here, you can see that this fairing should come out a lot further. And in fact, if I go from my 3 views and my photographs, then it should come out to this pencil line here. Now, as you know, it's been designed to be that size. And you can see the size of the cutout, the notch in the tailplane. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the tailplane bigger, that notch bigger, and I'm going to glue that bit to the fuselage and make a new end piece for in here and put some block in here. Now, it is going to weaken the tailplane slightly because the internal structure is built with plywood along there and plywood along there. So what I'm going to actually be doing is weakening that a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be too bad. What it will give me is a brake line, a panel brake line outboard, right where it should be. And then I won't have this overhanging section here, which is very vulnerable, because this bit can then be stuck to this section that's cut out. What that will also mean, if I just push it back in again, what that'll also mean is I can extend this out to that line with some more litho plate and just go over the top with filler and actually glue this down to that section there, and then I'll, fill the joint between the 2 panels. And we'll have a much bigger section, which will mean I can do a much bigger radius in here. And the reason I want the bigger radius there is because you can probably see, you might be able to see, that the anti-spin strake comes right out to the edge of that panel. And where it is there, my anti-spin strake is only going to be half the thickness that it needs to be. It needs to be that wide. So when the judges look at that, they're going to say, right, well, the anti-spin strake is that wide, the panel is there, so they should line up. And on mine, they will now if I move this out. Now, the reason this is not right is because the width of the fuselage is not right. Remember, this is the Jerry Bates design, and Jerry has used he hasn't used my 3-view to get the size of the fuselage right. And the fuselage is actually 10mm too wide here than it should be. And that's why all of this is a bit out, because the fuselage is too wide. And I can't do anything about that now. There's nothing I can do. I've just got to try and adapt everything to make it look right. And if it looks right, it is right, even if it isn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to cut along there. I'll mark it out first with a pencil and then I'm going to cut along there. Every time I open this bottle, I have to unjam it. Every time. This is creating a new face for the opposing side of this. So this will now get glued to the fuselage. And this new piece of ply on the end here will provide the face to this bit. So we'll have to do the same in a second here and face this section and also inside there. So I think what I'll do is I'll put some block inside both pieces to give us something for this to attach to. Now you can see that we've got a much bigger block on the fuselage, and that will allow us to make that bit wider underneath and this bit wider on the top. Still end up with a vulnerable area just here, but I think if I radius that, it shouldn't be so bad. Okay, so now I need to fill in the rear section of the tailplane in a similar manner to that and add another ply facing to it. But I'll add the ply facing once I've actually fitted the tailplane on there so that it's a really tight fit. You'll see in a minute. So the area we've got to fill in is here. So all I'm going to do is cut myself a chunk of this. If you stab it with the scalpel, you can hold it. While you feed it in to do things like this. So if we try and put the tailplane on, we find that it's not clearing, and that's the thickness of that 64th is stopping that. And we need to put some 64th in there as well So we do, in fact, I wonder whether we do need some 64th in there. We normally would, but I think we can get away without. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand a 64th off of this tailplane to make that fit. If I go too far, then we'll put some 64th in there to fill the gap. You can see we're nearly there. Right, and that's gone perfectly home and it's beautifully flush. Okay, so what I need to do now is to make that gap wide enough to take a piece of 64th, and at the moment it isn't quite. So what I do to make that happen is I take some sandpaper and I put the backing side against the ply that I want to keep, and then you simply force it into the slot. It may take a bit of jiggling at first, but once it starts you'll be away. With a bit of luck, that'll fit in there then. So all we do is we hold that up against this bit while we put some glue along this edge. And once that's set, we take the tailplane off again, if we can get it up. There we go. Now all we have to do is trim this to size. Now the moment of truth, will it still fit? Indeed it does. And there we go. And then if we extend the litho plate out to this edge and round and whack more filler on, we're away. So there you can see I've added another piece of litho plate, just curved the radius, and that's glued to the block that is now glued to the fuselage. So when I pull the tailplane off, hopefully that litho plate will stay put. So there we go. There we can see that the tailplane is slid back and we've got the litho plate still on there. So we need to put some filler over that, and we can increase the radius of the leading edge, and I still need to do the underside, but you get the idea. And here you can see that the underside has now got the piece of litho plate glued on as well. So what we'll do next is we'll just smother the area in some more filler, and we can hopefully increase that radius just there so that the anti-spin strake will butt against it nicely. Don't worry about the gaps you see in the litho plate. They are flush, but there's just a small gap. But the filler that I'm about to put on will take care of a lot of that. So I didn't show you this bit, but all I've done is I've splodged some filler in the around the fillet. There'll need to be some more on there because I can see some gaps already. I also added some fine line tape, which is the PVC grain tape you can see. This marks out where the panel lines are going to be. So when I sand this, I leave the tape on and it'll create a ridge that will make this section look like it's a separate panel. Well, that's the hope anyway. All right, so we'll let this set. I'll probably do a little bit of carving when it hits the cheese stage, and then we'll sand it, and I'll either show some of the sanding or we'll come back when it's all sanded. Okay, so I sanded it down before coming back to the video. What I did was I actually used the permagrit files, needle files and the round file, but while the filler was still going off at the cheesy stage, which actually worked really well, and I was able to rough out most of it. And by the time I was getting close, it was hardening up nicely, so I was able to go a little bit more aggressively and get the shape. But I think you can see we've got a nice fillet there now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop this tape off, and you should see, hopefully, that we now have a raised edge. Okay? And that's, you can just feel it. It's only the thickness of the tape, so it's only probably a 64th of an inch thick. A little bit of filler got on the glasswork there. So it's only a 64th of an inch thick. And it may vanish when we sand all of this down, but hopefully it won't. But it's easy enough to put back. And I've still got a little bit more work to do through here. With a bit more filler and just getting it right, but I may leave that. There's a little bit missing just here. I may leave this until the fuselage is in primer and we start addressing, you know, bits that aren't quite right. I think probably my main focus now will be to try and do the same on the other side that I've done on this side. So that's open up the tailplane section so it's bigger, add the litho plate and the filler, and hopefully make the other side so that the tailplane still will slide in on and off. You can see the lip is still a little bit susceptible, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was. And the lower section has this very large fillet on the other side, this nice big radius. So it's not as vulnerable as it was the way it was. And I'm much happy with this radius now. We can put the anti-spin strake along here and it'll come out to the same depth as this panel, which is how it should be on the photographs. So although it's not quite right, it'll look right, which is what we really want to do. So the other side has been done, and you can see how I've done it. Just a bit of a patchwork of litho plate, curved and bonded to the fuselage section of the fairing. And then when you close the gap, that's what you're left with. The wrinkles in this are actually really quite nice. It's all going to get covered with filler anyway, but I do quite like the wrinkles in this, and I might even lift the edges of this a little bit. Although a lot of this is going to get filled in with filler along through here and a big fairing. But these edges here where it's lifted slightly are similar to these edges here. As you can see, it's just a little bit wrinkled and a bit lifted. So we'll try and replicate that if we can. So here we've the fairing now that it's been sanded down, and you can see how it merges into the tailplane fairing. All is looking really good now, and we have a significant sort of ridge there which is on the full size, so that's also worked out well. You can see this is just lifted a little bit in the corner, which is lovely. It's just what I want, because the full size is also a bit tatty like that. So the fairing's done on this side as well, right under the tailplane. It's all done. And there's a panel line there at the moment, but it'll probably get better defined later on. And there's a little tiny area of low there which just needs a bit of filler, but I did put a little panel line in on there. And this side is also nicely smoothed, and any of the glass ridges removed, so it's perfect now. Coming up forward, you'll also see that I've fitted the brass slider rail for the canopy. That's fitted now. If you look down inside, you can probably just about see that there's I don't know whether you can see it or not. Let's get the shine on it. There's a screw, a little brass screw, slotted screw, not Phillips, you know, a normal straight slotted screw, and that runner is in now. So what we need to do next, if that's what I decide to do next, is that I need some litho plate sections that come up from the deck of the fuselage, as it were, and then up and just kick over the top of this, just sit along that ridge. Let's see if I got a picture of that to show you. There we go, there's a bit there. So you can see that the fairing ends here, and then you have this aluminium section that just goes over the top of, from the fuselage up to the top of the rail, and then it just kicks just over the top of the, just bends over the top of the rail. So we'll might add that next. I'm not sure. I'll have a look around. We're getting closer and closer to the to putting a coat of primer on this, because you really can't tell what's going on with all these shapes, and with it being all different colours and different textures, it's very difficult to tell. So I think I'm getting quite close to having to put some primer on so that we can see exactly where we're at with the surface. Okay, I think that'll do you for this video. It gives you a bit of an update and you can see where we're at. So if you've enjoyed the video, please click like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.